Support this podcast by visiting shop.johntilton.com. I don't like forgetting important things I've read, but I can't stand dog-earing books or marking up pages with yellow highlights. Ugh. That's why I use book darts, a clever, paper-thin line marker. I just slip one onto the page and point it at the passage I want to remember. Then I can easily come back to it later without leaving any permanent damage to the book. You can buy a couple hundred or try a sample pack by visiting my website, johntilton.com. That's JONTILTON.com. Thanks for your support. Enjoy this week's interview. Welcome to Cause of Craft. I'm your host, John Tilton. Why do we create? Where do our ideas come from? What does our craft say about us? These are the ideas we explore here on the show. Each episode, I interview a different guest, from writers and painters to musicians and filmmakers. Together, we investigate the creative process and the reasons behind why we create. Are there crossroads between two completely different art forms? After you listen to my discussion with painter Evan Harrington, I think that you'll find there certainly is. We discover many similarities between our creative approaches, even though our work is incredibly different. We also discuss Evan's interest in aviation, the benefits to following format early in your career, and his latest exhibition at the Silverman Gallery. That's right, you can see Evan's beautiful paintings in person from October 30th through November 28th. Stop by the Silverman Gallery in Holicong, PA, just outside of Doylestown. And if you'd like to say hello, he'll even be there in person on Saturday, October 30th and Sunday, November 7th. Check the show notes for more details. I hope you enjoy our conversation. So welcome to the show, Evan. I'm excited to talk with you.
Oh, thanks, John. I really appreciate the opportunity and looking forward to speaking with you.
Is there a defining moment or group of moments that led you to become an artist or to pursue art?
Yeah, it was actually, the decision was pretty simple. I grew up with my dad being an artist, and he was a professional illustrator for 30 years. So I kind of grew up with him working in a studio. So between watching him paint and enjoying reading through art books, it was kind of a no-brainer for me.
Do you have an early memory of seeing him paint? Or how young were you, or was this just a part of your life so much that you can't even separate that out?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty much like any other memory of when you were a baby. It's you don't remember being born. You just kind of just start little tidbits. That's what I remember.
You always had an interest in it. Did you always know that you wanted to pursue this professionally as well?
I did. I don't think kids really realize the monetary side of things, but I just figured that this would be a great way to spend the majority of my time doing. So it kind of just naturally unfolded, obviously, because my dad was in it professionally, and he still is. He's been that kind of guide for just teaching me how to make a living at it. But that's kind of the whole nother angle. Really, it was just, this is what I want to spend my time doing. So
yeah, I would imagine having your father there probably helped some of that intimidation that would be there from the monetary side, just because you have someone in your life, obviously your dad is someone very close to you, who has been able to find a way to do it.
Right.
In some way, it probably seemed like something that was possible to grasp, as difficult as it would be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's funny because my brother decided a much more, I would say, practical field and to go into. And the irony is that with my family, the practical field was the harder field to sell to my parents. So it's kind of I had a very different angle for sure than most kids growing up.
Now, you do oil painting, and that's what your father does as well. And then the style, the terminology, you'll have to correct and inform me on here, but it's Impressionist style. Can you talk a little bit about what is the approach that you take, and what are the technical terms to the style and technique that you use?
Yeah, it varies. I would say it's as complicated as classifying a piece of music. You know, if you have a country western song, if you're a country western musician, you would think, you know, that is such like a generic term. So it really is tough to pin down my work. There's a lot of times it is very impressionistic. Impressionistic being really you're capturing the visual using. It tends to be more expressionistic brushstrokes, but the image is fairly representational. You can actually tell what you're looking at. So I do dabble in that, but sometimes my work is more layered, a lot more glazing, a lot more polished. It depends on the image. So I'm with a gallery now that kind of labels their artist as impressionistic. And I think I can fit into that category, but I always kind of travel through different genres. So,
What does that process look like for you? So to kind of bring the writing analogy in, and again, this is just because this is what I'm used to understanding. We talk about how there's planners and pantsers, and planners is kind of self-explanatory, but pantsers is the idea of like flying by the seat of your pants, kind of making things up as you go. I kind of find myself a blend of both of these things, but is there a certain approach that you lean towards when you create something?
when I was first starting off, my process was incredibly regimented and predictable, and I had to lay things out in a painting a certain way or paint certain things in order for me to feel a sense of accomplishment or really get the results that I wanted. But kind of as time goes on and you kind of become bored with predictable processes, especially when you're creating artwork, the desire is to have like to offer something new to the audience. So I find that kind of the better I get, the more that I can kind of lose some of my checklist items in a painting and just allow really the painting to kind of take on its own form. And really that ends up being sometimes a lot less time moving paint around with the paintbrush and more just kind of looking at what I already have down and kind of making more decisions.
Is a lot of that at the beginning, you kind of learning almost the language, the techniques? Again, I think about that with writing. It's like, okay, well, you learn the traditional approach to it. So you understand the core of what works, and then you start to play around with it. Is there something similar going on for painting?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's actually, I would say it's very similar. I mean, I remember in high school, like writing essays and you had the essay format and you kind of follow that the core processes that they kind of automatically create good results because it gives you a format to create a complete thought. And that's how I started. So I would definitely say that is like learning techniques. And also when you follow a format or a process, it allows you to spend more time kind of developing your own eye because you know that you're going to have certain results if you do things a certain way. So you can kind of start to create your own voice. And then slowly it's like muscle memory. You just kind of, you don't even worry about any of that stuff. And you're really just focused on your results.
And so as you start to play around with things, is it a constant tweaking, or do you find years or eras of your life where you're like, oh, I'm really focused in this sort of direction and then I'll change it one day? Or how does that process evolve in terms of picking the direction that you want to take your work next?
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I kind of learned that through sort of a negative circumstance in a sense. But for a time, I had been working extensively doing my artwork. I was in the studio a lot. I had a few shows, and I wasn't burned out. But for a little bit of time, I took a break and did some other lines of work just to kind of get rejuvenated. And I had just gotten married, and it was just there was a lot going on. So I kind of departed from art just for a little while. I maintained my skills. I did portraits and whatnot, but the freelance artwork I kind of left to the side for a little while. And what ended up happening is I kind of had a vision that I was developing in my own work. And when I kind of departed to do these other lines of work, I kind of forgot where I was at. So that was kind of a negative circumstance. So sometimes things change just based off of you're not familiar with what you were doing before. It's a fairly abstract thing. I mean, when I'm painting, something like subject matter that used to be really intriguing, I almost don't see why I wanted to paint it now. And I still love the old paintings, but I'm not drawn to painting the subject matter. So it's kind of strange if you stop for a certain period of time. Sometimes you lose that momentum, and I've kind of learned that I need to. You kind of need to stay in it constantly, at least to some degree.
Well, I think some of that makes sense too, because people in general in creating something it's just such a personal process. No matter what degree of professionalism you have about creating something, there's something that of yourself that you're pouring into it. So I'd imagine that, if you take any sort of break, or even just as time goes on in general, just different life events happen and we get older and we have different things that are important to us and we see the world in different ways. And so it's almost natural that the subject matter that you pursue or the style that you pursue will change as you change.
Yeah, exactly. No, I definitely agree with that.
Something else I know that you have some interest in, at least you did before. Are you still interested in planes and aviation? Is that still something that you're connected with?
Yeah, I am actually. I always loved airplanes, and we used to go to antique airplanes. There's like an airport that's close by that has a lot of old biplanes and whatnot. And while I was doing my artwork, I kind of just started taking some flying lessons, and about 10 years later now, it's I always tell people that I do a little bit of a disservice to myself, and that all my hobbies I turn into occupations. I currently work for a company, and we do charters. So I actually fly a jet and turboprop for a company. It's been great. It kind of gets me out of the studio, and it definitely gives me plenty of content to paint. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is this another avenue of inspiration that's separate from the art, or is it almost a way to take a break from everything that goes on in your painting?
Maybe it's like almost like a separate personality in a sense.
Sure, yeah.
Although I used to, in the very start of college, I actually had checklists for my paintings if things weren't going well, or if they were going well, I just kind of needed to push to the next step. I had checklists that I wrote. So I've kind of been a checklist person anyways. So I kind of fit into aviation that way. And then as I do it now, when you're painting, you're by yourself all day, and you're kind of essentially staring at a wall while you're working. At least I am with my easel. And so you go from, staring at a wall to being at 35,000 feet with hundreds of miles of visibility. It's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, but
Yeah, changing it up a little bit.
absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, at the same time, it is almost like I don't know. I think for the artist, it's in some ways there's no like true escape completely out of it, because it feels like every moment I'm like awake, I'm like something is related to my writing project, and it's tough to take a breath and
Yeah.
take a step back to kind of renew that energy.
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, it's like, well, creation is such a part of who the artist is that it's difficult to separate it out.
I think what kind of comes down to, and kind of going to my third interest that I tend to do, which is woodworking. I'm very much a hands-on person. So hand-eye coordination is like really the thing I love to kind of develop. And so all three of those pursuits are very much in that avenue. So I think they just exercise different portions of that. So for me, that portion kind of travels freely between them all. And then in terms of the tactile differences, moving paint or sanding wood or flying, moving flight controls, it's kind of just they're their own art forms in a sense. I like to kind of have things constantly busy and changing, so it kind of works for me.
Having something that your mind is processing, or
Yeah, yeah.
can you describe a little bit more about, are you making tables? Are you making sculptures?
Sometimes furniture. A lot of times it's just working on the house, like doing paneling. Or I used to work
Okay,
for.
cool.
Yeah, I used to work for a company for many years that they did everything from framing the house to all the cabinets. I mean, all the millwork. It was a very unusual company to work for, because nowadays everything's purchased as a unit. So you can buy your kitchen cabinets from here. You have a framing crew that's separate, but we actually kind of saw whole projects through, which was really unique. That was fun, developing skills in that realm, and then applying it to like my own house or friends' houses, whatever.
Was that job the origin of your interest in that, or had it come before?
It came before. Like there's a lot of construction that went on in my family. I mean, there's my grandfather was he was an iron worker, and a lot of my relatives were as well. And then my dad had a lot of interest in woodworking, and that's kind of really our family trait. And then so it kind of gets naturally passed down just as a general interest.
So going back to your artwork a little bit, so you paint portraits. I've seen you do also portraits of animals, landscape, still life. There's a pretty broad spectrum there. How do you go about, is that like mood based on what you pursue next in terms of a subject? How do you resolve like what to work on?
For the portraits, it's rather straightforward. I'm usually approached as to, someone wants either a friend or themselves painted. And then pretty much the project with those are to really to understand the person, get a sense of like, who they were or, what they do, and really start to develop a personality behind the painting. So that's a little bit more straightforward. And with that, people want their portraits to look like them and the best form of them. So I would say it's probably one of the hardest portions of the art form in terms of not too many people paint portraits very well. It's very rigorous, and it is one of the things that I have to spend a lot of time keeping my skills sharp there because it's just so exacting. The flip side of that is the parameters are a little bit simpler, and the sky's not the limit. And then someone's not going to necessarily commission me to do a Picasso style where they're different
Sure, yeah.
their nose is on their forehead and whatnot. But so people know me for a certain kind of look in portraiture, and so that's rather straightforward. I love doing them, and it's a great way to meet people and learn about their lives. It's just a fun process to be a part of. So that's the portrait side. I guess what I call it the freelance side and more of my own vision. That's a little bit harder to come by. I used to do a lot of still lives, and I would be setting up still lives. I would look at old master paintings, position, fruits, vases, whatever, very traditionally. And after doing so many paintings like that, I kind of was gravitating towards something that's a little bit more natural in its composition, something that's like if you walk into a room and just how the objects are naturally placed. I've become more interested in that. So the difficult part is it's a lot harder to create interesting compositions. You really have to be vetting a lot more visuals. So now I kind of wait until I find something that really stands out to me, and then that's when I really go at it painting. So
What are you looking for when something stands out? Is that a consistent thing, or is it almost inconsistent because that's why it stands out?
oh, that's a great question. I actually I would think both. Andrew Wyeth talked about there being like the abstract flash, and pretty much something catches you from the corner of your eye that draws your attention. And I don't know if it's developed in the artist's eye, just from the artist working. I can't really explain that portion, but all I know is that when I'm working and I'm driving down the road. Actually, I was driving down the road this morning, and there was this beautiful cornfield, and there was this woman sitting on the porch and this bouquet of flowers, and it caught my eye, and I wish I had some way to document it because it was such like a neat, timeless scene. It was just something about it was just very peaceful, and so you kind of have to wait for moments like that. Now, the best way of doing that is to be out and about experiencing the world. So that's
Yeah.
I kind of tend to wait for those moments.
So then are you taking a reference photo of something, or are you needing to
Yeah.
set up your easel on location? I'm looking at some of the images on your website and it's like, oh, well, this is probably not in your house.
Right.
How are you taking your artwork to that, or are you taking
Yeah.
the scene with you?
Photography has been probably one of the most helpful tools, particularly since I am painting more representationally. It is so difficult to, capture exact moments of light with, certain shapes and shadows or even if I'm painting anything that's to do with wildlife. It's kind of a resource that I feel like people frown upon, but it's kind of silly not to use at the same time. It's just so exacting when you need to be. However, I really tend not to rely heavily on photographs. So if I'm painting a landscape or whatever, I try and do sketches from my head of what I
Mm.
kind of first saw, try and remember as many components as I could to kind of give it that feeling. Then I kind of cross check it with a photograph, which photographs tend, at least my photographs tend to be rather flat and not as interesting. So I have to kind of keep that raw mental image I had, even though I have a photo reference. It's kind of a blended process, I would say. And sometimes I use photographs a little bit more than I should. Sometimes I don't use them at all. It just depends.
You're making kind of this blended, it's photo real, but it's also an interpretation
Mm-hmm.
of what's there. And so we talked about how you run into something that you want to paint, that you want to capture. When you go about capturing it, what are you looking to capture? What are you looking to almost like alter about what's in front of you to bring out something that you're seeing in it? Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah,
it's a kind of a
yeah,
tough concept to
yeah. And
explain.
I'm afraid that my answer might be even more
Yeah.
vague. I don't fully know. It's kind of like music in the sense where there's certain notes that are kind of universally pleasing to people. I mean, not everyone's gonna like every song, but there's such a repeated format for chords that work well together. And so sometimes that's it. If there's a scene that's the contrast is very interesting or the focal point's very strong, I'll naturally be drawn to that. But sometimes it's a lot more subtle. Sometimes it's mainly because of the subject matter that I find interesting, or perhaps it reminds me of another painting that I saw that I felt was fairly successful, and it just kind of resonates with me. Like the scene I saw this morning with the woman with the cornfield, it was just kind of interesting because it kind of looked like a Wyeth painting, but it was in a complete different avenue. And sometimes as artists, as much as they like to think that they're the inventive, they really are just kind of reorganizing what's already been done in a sense. So I was drawn to that scene. I was like, oh, that would be kind of neat to do a Wyeth painting, but in a more of a lively color scheme. I don't know. This is an example I just thought of this morning, but it is kind of interesting. There's so many different directions to go into, and there's so many different reasons why a painting is created.
So do you ever have a moment where you have something in mind and you're painting it, and then something almost like shouts out to you, like, pay attention to this aspect that you weren't seeing before? Like do you ever,
Yeah.
are you ever in the work and then all of a sudden you see something new, even though you've been looking at it for hours?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The start of my paintings tend to be fairly animated. I'll use like fairly big brushes and kind of paint very aggressively. I know what I kind of want the paint to look like, so I'm just trying to get paint on the canvas, kind of really get the process going. And then in a weird way, I kind of just like burn out from that initial energy. Put the painting aside. I usually let it dry. I usually actually just turn the canvas towards the wall, so I'm not staring at it all the time. In a day or two, and that's usually works perfectly with like if I have a flying trip for a day. It gets me out of the studio, kind of clear my brain of what I was doing. Then the next day I'll go back in and take a look at the painting and then have another whole direction to take it. And it's never really what's expected. Whatever the initial push is, it always changes in the next round of painting and the third and fourth and whatever rounds. So
Well, that's really fascinating because so another connection here to writing, and this is something that I've experienced and that is almost like recommended. I know, like Stephen King is a big advocate of that method, where you're almost describing what I see as, oh, it's a first draft. You get the first draft out, you put all this energy in it, you just get that first draft done, and then you separate yourself from it. You let it sit to the side, both to kind of let yourself understand what's working and not working about it and have a new eye when you come to it, but also so that you can, it opens you up to changing the direction. And
right,
so it's
right.
so interesting that you have like almost like this first draft process where
Uh-huh.
it's you're getting down on the canvas, just the beginning, and you know that I'll revisit this with fresh eyes after I take a little bit of a break.
Yeah, that's actually the probably the closest analogy I've heard yet to the process. That sometimes it's a little bit of a tricky thing too, because sometimes procrastination can kind of creep into as well. Like if you have a really exciting start to a painting, and you're really moving along well, and then you kind of reach this point where it might be some of the more tedious portions of a painting where
Yeah.
you don't really know what to do, or you have to detail a certain area. It's kind of tempted to kind of leave the painting just facing the wall for another week or two. But
Yeah, I understand that too, because yeah, you don't want the recommended process to also be the excuse. Like it's almost, that's why maybe like setting the time limit, or even, okay, I'm going to work on something else. I'm going to do another first draft and
yeah,
then put that first draft aside and come back to it. So yeah, you don't want it to be an excuse for getting out of your routine and falling behind on your work.
yeah,
That's so interesting because when I was thinking about doing a podcast, I had this idea for, the title of the show is Cause of Craft. And I was thinking about the reasons behind why I write and the process that I use, and thinking about talking about those two things together. And one thing that came to mind was, what if this isn't just like a writer thing? I have people that I know who are in different arts. And I was curious about, well, what are the similarities and differences between those processes and between how people create and why they create? And I've been so happy that I decided, to expand the question beyond just writers, because I felt like I've learned a lot through the techniques and process of other people's crafts, and finding that they might look at something completely differently, but some of the root behind why is the same. And so there's almost like something to learn there.
I absolutely agree. And I had a student that they studied painting with me for, I don't know, about 2 years or maybe 3. I remember the first question is basically like the last time they had drawn was with basically with crayons in like kindergarten. And this individual collected a lot of my work and was always interested in art. They had a mother that was an artist, and they just had an interest in like, oh, well, maybe it's something that I could try my hand at. And they were a fairly accomplished pianist. They are a fairly accomplished pianist. And so it was interesting. I didn't really know how to describe a lot of the terminology. So I kind of, when I was instructing this particular person, I tried my best at just describing everything in the media that they knew, which was music. So explaining things like composition and, warm and cool colors, it sounds fairly straightforward, but it's unbelievably complex. So I kind of related those things to the keys in music. And it was interesting. They naturally were very gifted, you could tell, in a visual sense. But this individual picked up things so quickly because they're relating it to their other art form that they already knew about. And the progress is remarkable if you already have some of that knowledge. So truthfully, I think any of the arts are very interchangeable, whether they're visual or auditory or written. Or
it almost feels like, how people talk about learning different languages, and it's like once you learn, I forget the number, it's like once you learn like 4 languages, like you just can learn the rest of them super easily.
That's interesting.
Because it's like art, it's kind of has its own language to it. And again, it's like, when people are talking a language that they know, you don't even think about like formulating the words just come out and they're the thoughts. And, maybe you get into a complex discussion and then you're trying to grasp for certain words. But if you're just having a normal conversation, it's your language.
Right.
So you have an exhibition coming up. Can you talk a little bit about that and how people can see your work in person?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's going to be a show at the Silverman Gallery, which is in Buckingham in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And I'll probably have about between 20 and 25 paintings there, most of which have been done within the past few years. And it's a fairly varied collection of paintings. I have a lot more landscapes than I've had at probably any other show. And everything's very themed out. I've had a very busy year with, I got trained in a new jet, and I've been, like I said, I was working in my house. It's been quite a whirlwind year. And so I think the work really reflects my desire to have a very quiet environment, and the paintings are very quiet, but I really have enjoyed working on them. It's but they do. I'm kind of looking at them now, actually, as we speak. They tie together in a very unusual way. I have some moonlit scenes, and I also have some rather colorful flower paintings, but they kind of speak to each other, and there's a transition between them all in design and color. So it would be interesting to see them all on a wall. Right now, they're just scattered about my room, but to see them in a very formal setting actually would be exciting for myself.
Do you find that connection surprising to you, or does it make sense with, again, what we were talking about before with, you said they were all done relatively recently, so you're at, again, a time in your life where you're seeing things probably in a similar way in a certain time span.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely true. Kind of like what I was describing earlier, when I'm working on paintings, I'll turn around all the ones in my room so I'm not looking at them. So I kind of hope that shows are very cohesive, but I don't ever aim for that because I feel like that impedes on the quality of each piece. So I actually, when I'm working, everything's kind of away. I'm just focusing on what's on my easel. And then, as I'm kind of now starting to put finishing touches on paintings, varnishing them, framing them, it's kind of nice to see that they do speak to each other. I always hope for that, but like I said, I don't really aim for that necessarily.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then the way you describe it too, speaking to each other, like giving them sort of their own sense of agency, like it's you are the painter, but it's almost like, again, like I think people use the term creation and in a way that makes sense because you're almost creating this new thing that exists and it's almost alive in its own right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do see it that way.
Well, good. Well, so we talked about the gallery where people can see your work in person. Do you want to let people know your website or other ways they can see your work?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think there's a few ways of getting to my website, but it's simply my name, eharringtonstudio.com. I think evanharringtonstudio.com works as well, I think. If it doesn't, I apologize.
I'll check it beforehand and make sure it's linked. So, well, good. Well, Evan, thank you so much for your time. I know with all your interests here with art, aviation, and the housework and all this, that you lead a busy life. So I'm really appreciative of your time. Thank you so much for coming on Cause of Craft.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I actually look forward to hearing some of your other podcasts. It'll be fun. I'll listen to it while I paint.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Cause of Craft. You can see Evan's artwork online at eharringtonstudio.com and in person at the Silverman Gallery in Holicong, Pennsylvania, from October 30th to November 28th. He'll be on hand on both Saturday, October 30th and Sunday, November 7th. Check the show notes for times and more details. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode, and follow Cause of Craft on Instagram for the latest news and updates, including visual companions for every episode. If you enjoy the show, please consider sharing with a friend and leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. And if you have feedback, suggestions, or guest recommendations, send an email to john@causeofcraft.com. That's JON@causeofcraft.com. Thanks again for listening, and see you next week.